my name's Gary Ford, Managing Director of Tiger Hobbies Limited, UK hobby imports and distributors, and welcome to the Pacific Part 2, Episode 7, The Battle for Okinawa. In the last episode, we looked at the sinking of the battleship Yamato, which was part of the Battle for Okinawa, which started on April the 1st, 1945. Before this, the islands of Okinawa were identified as the ideal jumping-off point for the invasion of Japan's main islands by the Allies. The Japanese authorities had warned the Okinawans that the Allies, especially the Americans, were beasts who would murder, rape and eat their children. It would be better if they died fighting or ended their lives for the Emperor. This set the scene for one of the most bloody and tragic battles of World War II that would leave almost 250,000 dead, mostly civilians, and children placed in the front line to fight the soldiers along with the 80,000 Japanese army. Behind me is a map of Okinawa. There is a long island running from, say, northeast to southwest that the Japanese would concentrate their forces down south behind what would be known as the Shuri Line and the Mutabu Peninsula, plus a fortified island called Ieshima just off that peninsula. The Allies gathered a fleet of 1,300 vessels, from major warships to landing and support ships, with over 180,000 assault troops of the US 10th Army and the US Marine Corps. In this force is a large part of the British Pacific Fleet with 30 major vessels and over 300 aircraft. Under Operation Iceberg, the landings occurred on the southwest beaches of Ogashi. Before this went in, the US Navy bombarded the beach with over 100,000 naval shells, and the assault force expected high casualties on the initial landings. In the end though, the assault was met with little resistance, and so thousands and thousands of Allied soldiers were soon ashore with the loss of just 28 troops, mainly in accidents. A large beachhead was secured and heavy equipment was soon starting to land, including tanks. Within hours of landing, they had captured the major airbase of Kadena and were consolidating their positions. The Japanese were much actually further away from the beaches and actually naval gunfight. They'd learnt their lessons from previous battles. And well dug in, its mission was to cause the maximum amount of casualties for the Allies and make them pay in blood for Okinawa. The 10th Army Commander, General Buckner, happy with the progress, released the US Marine divisions up north to take and secure the Mutabu Peninsula, and the army units would then let free to swing south towards the Shuri Line. The main fighting at the time was on a number of small islands that needed to be taken to be used as fleet anchorage, airfields, and to mount 155mm guns to provide artillery cover. The Japanese Special Attack Squadrons, or kamikaze, chucked everything they got at the gathered naval fleet off Okinawa, making it the deadliest kamikaze attack of the war. Starting on the 6th of April 1945, with 400 aircraft, they plunged into these warships, causing massive amounts of damage. Not only kamikaze aircraft, but kamikaze boats, though not as many. In fact, by the 22nd of June 1945, over 2,000 kamikaze aircraft were used against the Allies in and around Okinawa. Not the largest naval battle, but the bloodiest in US Navy history, with over 10,000 casualties, and for the first time, more dead than wounded. And almost 400 ships were damaged and over 25 sunk, plus the loss of many aircraft on the decks and in the hangars of damaged aircraft carriers. The kamikazes had been causing severe problems since the first known attack during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, as mentioned before. And just before this, on the 19th of March, the USS Franklin became the most damaged fleet carrier to be hit by kamikazes, losing 800 of her crew. The naval battle of Okinawa was so intense that Nimitz had to relieve the fleet commanders for rest and replace them and rename the fleet. So it started as the 5th Fleet but ended up as the 3rd Fleet. The young Japanese flyers that flew these missions had very little training, maybe 8 to 10 hours, basically taught how to take off and not land very well, as they wouldn't be required to do it. And they were given the minimum amount of fuel to get the job done. By the 7th of April 1945, the US Army had taken the central plain of Okinawa and reached the east coast, with the US Marines pushing north securing the main isthmus, cutting off the Matubu Peninsula. And by the 13th of April, the 22nd Marines had reached the very northern tip of the island of Okinawa. All seemed to be going well, with the minimum amount of casualties. But heavier Japanese resistance was encountered on the Matubu Peninsula, especially around its central mountain. Its rocky ridges proved tough going for the Marines, but by the 18th of April, they had secured the mountain and the surrounding areas. The US Army's 77th Division then assaulted the island of Ieshima just off the peninsula, and they encountered fanatical Japanese soldiers and even civilians, some armed with spears. But this was secured by the 21st of April 1945, and soon the airfields on the island were operational in Allied hands. US forces may have been led into a false sense of security, with nearly all of the northern and central Okinawa in their hands, other than a few Japanese holdouts. The largest number of Japanese forces were in the southern part of the island, behind what was known as the Shuri defence line. And this would be a far, far tougher nut to crack. And this would last, or take, until basically the end of June, and thousands of Allied casualties. Names like Sugarloaf Hill, Horseshoe Hill, Conical Hill, Shuri Castle and Hacksaw Ridge and Big Apple Ridge would be scenes of some of the most intense fighting in the Pacific. It was in the south that the Japanese intended to bleed the Allies dry and make them pay for every inch of Okinawa in blood, which in respects they did, but at the same time seal their own fate and the horrors that would come later from the skies. Within days of landing, General Buckner ordered the US Army to assault the Shuri line, and its first obstacles were the Cactus Ridge and the Pinnacle. Here they met tenacious resistance from Japanese troops. But by the 8th of April, these areas had been secured, but at a cost of some 1,500 US casualties and over 5,000 Japanese dead. Very few prisoners were being taken at this point. But these defences were only part of the forward outpost before the main Shuri line. While the fighting in Okinawa was getting more intense, news from Europe that the German surrender did nothing for the morale of troops dealing with the Japanese. Plus, earlier on the 12th of April, news of the death of President Roosevelt had come through. The Japanese dropped leaflets on the US forces showing Roosevelt and saying how sorry that he was dead, and the US forces would be soon joining him. Soon the US forces were assaulting the actual Shuri line and were coming across well-defended ridges. The first was, I think, Kayaksu Ridge, which cost again many US casualties. The next one was the Madeira Ridge, known to the US as Hacksaw Ridge, the scene of one of the most famous Medals of Honor on Okinawa. Desmond Doss, the conscientious objector who served as a combat medic. He was portrayed by Andrew Garfield in the 2016 movie Hacksaw Ridge. Already a veteran of combat in Guam and the Philippines, he refused to carry a weapon and was already an holder of the Bronze Star. He saved almost 100 wounded men, getting them to the top of the escarpment. In the process, he was wounded 4 times and suffered 17 shrapnel wounds from a grenade while trying to save his comrade. And even when being carried on a stretcher, he was hit by a sniper's bullet before finally being evacuated. The Japanese had turned Hacksaw Ridge into a fortress of tunnels and bunkers with thousands of well-armed troops, and the US Army's 96th Division, the Deadeyes, found themselves in close combat with machine guns and grenades, and sometimes hand-to-hand combat. After attack and counterattack, the 96th started to get relief from the 77th Divisions, including the 307th Infantry Unit, which is actually Doss's unit, continued the fight, and it's here that Doss would win his Medal of Honor early in May 1945. By the 6th of May 1945, the 77th had secured the ridges, but the small area had cost the lives of almost 2,500 US soldiers and many more Japanese. While the fighting was ongoing across the line, the Japanese on the 4th of May 1945 put in a massive counterattack with 4 infantry brigades and 2 attempted flanking amphibious landing, one on the east coast and one on the west coast. They also hit the US force with 13,000 artillery shells. But the US was now on Okinawa with massive forces, and soon this attack was stopped. In fact, both amphibious landings were totally wiped out, with no survivors whatsoever by Navy and Air Forces. The Japanese counterattack came after heated arguments between senior Japanese officers, some who thought by defending well, they were doing their duty and making the US forces pay. But the failed attack was a bit of a turning point, and it wasted valuable Japanese forces. As the fighting intensified in the south, many US Army formations were exhausted, so they moved units from the northern part of Okinawa, where the fighting was tough but not as intense. The US Marines had been fighting in the north and still reasonably fresh, so they were sent to the south and the Shuri Line. One of these units were the 1st US Marine Infantry Division, known as the All Breed, and two of its Marines, Eugene Sledge, whose book With the All Breed, and Robert Leckie and his book Helmet for My Pillar, were the basis of the successful HBO TV series The Pacific. Not as popular in the UK as Band of Brothers, it's still my favourite of the Hank Spielberg war trilogy, the other being Masters of the Air, and it portrays the brutality of the Pacific War better than any other TV series or film. The scenes of the fight on Okinawa are not for the faint-hearted, and it shows the terrible conditions for both US and Japanese forces in the mud of the Shuri Line. I'm showing a clip from HBO's Pacific to show the fighting on the Shuri Bastion that shows the mud that covered the fighting area from the end of May 1945. So bad that basically it stopped any resupply vehicles, and equipment literally had to be carried by hand to the front line. The Japanese were getting desperate and were now really starting to abuse the Okinawans, who were not really Japanese, and they spoke a slightly different dialect and had a different culture, and the Japanese mainland people thought them inferior. The Japanese army were using Okinawans as shields or forcing them to fetch water and ammunition under heavy fire, and many were killed by US forces in the bitter fighting. But slowly some of the Okinawans were starting to take a chance and give themselves up to the US forces, and found that they didn't really want to eat them, but actually give them food and water and care. Battle-hardened soldiers of the Marines were finding themselves deeply upset at the state of some of the Okinawans, especially the children, as the fighting was becoming brutally inhuman and the end of the war could not come soon enough. At great cost, the US forces were breaking the Japanese on the Shuri Line, and the Japanese were retreating further to the south and now were held up in caves in a small toehold on the far south of the island. Here, terrible acts of desperation were acted out in the last desperate weeks of fighting, including 4,000 Imperial Japanese Navy personnel taking their own life, led by their admiral. General Buckner was also killed by Japanese artillery on the 18th of June, the most senior US serviceman to be killed in World War II in enemy action. By the 21st of June, the main fighting was over, but mopping up operations would continue until at least the 30th of June, making the Battle of Okinawa the most costly in the Pacific. It was literally 82 days of hell. In episode 8, we shall look at the aftermath of this horrendous battle and the consequences of mass casualty for the US and Allied forces on the potential invasion of Japan itself.